Looks like, I'm gonna wait till we hit 200. Okay, we've hit 200. All right, let's go. Hey, everybody, I'm Lisa Plagemeyer. Oh, somebody already has a hand raised. I'm Lisa Plagemeyer. I'm the Executive Director of the National Cybersecurity Alliance. Welcome to our Convene chat. We do these in conjunction with our Convene events. We do 2 of those a year. The next one's coming up in March in Florida, Clearwater Beach, a lovely place. And we have a really good slate of speakers. Lucas or Allie, can you put a link to that event in the chat, please? So one of the things we're going to do, probably about halfway through our session today, maybe 3/4 of the way, we're going to stop and do a giveaway for a ticket to our Convene event. You still have to get yourself to Clearwater. It's not that far from Tampa. Tampa's a big airport with a lot of flights. And we're going to give away a ticket to our 2-day event in Florida. All right. Ken and I met, this is Ken Fanger, everybody. Ken and I met in Cleveland. I was up there at an FBI meeting, or meeting of the, what is it, Northeast Ohio, what is it called again?
Consortium. Yeah,
Cyber Consortium, and it was being hosted by the FBI, and we get to see the gun safe. That was probably the coolest part of that building. Anyway, Ken and I struck up a conversation about humans and cybersecurity, and that's kind of the intersection where the National Cybersecurity Alliance does a lot of its work. And I invited him to do a Convene chat with us today. Ken, would you please introduce yourself and talk about what you do and your background and how you came to be interested in how we landed on this topic of humanizing security?
So I would love to. So I think it's been 3 years now. I wrote the book, Relax, A Guide to True Cybersecurity, because as all of us know, the way we sell cybersecurity is you're all going to die, everything's going to get lost, your company's going to get obliterated. And we've created this entire world of immense fear. And I started to talk with my users, I started to talk with my team, and I'll go into some depth on where that is. But I started to realize that when you create a constant level of fear, you also can create a constant level of numbness. You can only be in fear so long, and then you stop being afraid. And so I started to have the conversation, how do we change it to relax? How do we make the engagement about why it's good to be safe, not why it's bad to be broken? And so after I wrote this book, I started to present all over the United States. I started to talk with different groups about what I started to call humanizing security. We have a drive, and you'll see it in the penetration testing, in the red team, blue team, this idea that cybersecurity is this fundamental concept of technology. And the thing that's funny, I was presenting for colleges, and I thought it was interesting that only one college I've met has a psychology course required for a cybersecurity program. But the #1 attack vector is social engineering.
Yeah.
So we put a lot of emphasis on this idea of zero-day attack, penetration testing, but only about 10% of attacks come that way. The other 90% come from just how you manipulate a human being. And so as I started to do that and I started to talk to people, I started to reach out and realize we were losing a battle that we were spending more money on, more time on, more effort on, in the absolute wrong direction.
So you have a technical background. At what point did you have that light bulb moment that we're all just crying wolf, right? We're all just trying to scare people. And like you said, eventually people, they stop being scared and they turn to, I've witnessed that. Like the thing you told me, especially at the executive level, the C-suite level, all those risk assessments you've brought me, all these terrible things you've said that could happen, none of this has ever happened. So I really don't believe you anymore. And I'm just going to sign off on whatever risk assessment you bring me. When in your career did you have that light bulb moment that we're really just making people numb to the fear, and so fear is not a good motivator? It's not working.
And it's kind of funny because, so I started out my life, I have a business degree, not a computer science degree. I just had this neat talent of doing programming, which I actually didn't enjoy even. But back in 1990, if you could program and you were good at programming,
That's
you
your
were going to
job.
be a programmer. But I always remembered when I went, because my first job was with BP as a payroll programmer. And I remembered the executive that hired me, he said, the reason I hired you was you talk business. All your contemporaries only talked about computers. And so I carried that through my entire life. It is about business. Computers support business. Computers support people. And then I went through a 10KSB, 10,000 Small Business program back in 2016. and it said, look at what the future is. And I started to look at where IT was going and where technology was going. And we all heard about the increase in ransomware and email phishing. And I realized that was the direction it was going to go in. So I started to take classes, I started to go to conferences, and I kept hearing the same thing, like I said, over and over. We're going to die. You're going to lose your business. How many times have small businesses heard, your business is going to be obliterated if you get a breach? And the problem is, if you talk to people, no company knows of anyone that got obliterated by a breach, but everybody knows someone that got a breach. And it is a tragic event, but it's implied to be a devastating event. And that disconnect, that what I see in my world versus what you tell me, causes some real problems.
Years
And
ago, before I was at the National Cybersecurity Alliance, somebody attributed a stat of like something like 60% of small businesses go out of business after a cyber attack. But this was, I don't know, 4 or 5 years ago. Somebody attributed that to the NCA. And my predecessors had to do like press releases and all kinds of stuff to say this wasn't us, this isn't legitimate, we don't know where this came from. And it resurfaced about 2, 3 months ago on LinkedIn. Somebody used it again and attributed it to us again. LinkedIn in the comments is like, oh, not only is that not us, but it's not true. We don't know where that came from. And yeah, somebody's asking in the chat, how can I get your book? Where
it's
is
available on Amazon. You can go
great.
to kennethfanger.com, which is my speaker page. And yeah, I would love for as many people to kind of read it because it is lighthearted. I try to use humor. They're actual real events that happened to me. I can share one of them that isn't really a cyber attack, but it does talk to this conversation of how do you talk. So I was in charge of a pharmaceutical company, and we had a system when I was doing this that was 32 years old. And
A
it
little bit technical debt, just a little bit.
just a little bit. But when I got there, and I was only there for a few months, this was FDA, which meant that we had this law that required us to keep these batch records for 7 years for every drug we made. We lost that computer. I had gone to the CFO and said it's going to cost $4 million to replace this computer. And the CFO said, why would we do that? It has never failed us. And he had 32 years of history to support this. And I was like, being the IT guy, well, you're obviously being foolish. You should spend this money. 3 weeks later, it crashed and it took everything. And it cost us almost $80 million to recover. We had to bring in an expert from Germany, the only expert alive in the world. They had to try and repair the drives. But it was funny because in one of the presentations I was giving for Ohio State, the dean of Ohio State's IT department, I think it was Applied Sciences, came up to me and said, yes, but you need to remember that CFO had to make decisions between that $4 million going to you, to marketing, to plant upgrades. And so we're only one small part of a big journey. And that was very eye-opening to me because I always was like, how stupid, and I think cybersecurity people do this, how stupid you didn't think to defend yourself properly. And then after that statement, I started to realize they're making trade-offs just like we are. And in cybersecurity, we do this all the time. In cybersecurity training, we do this. We expect people to do things, but we don't take into account all the other things that they have in their day to do. And so I came up, started on Technology Partners, started to move into cybersecurity, and then I started to really move into cybersecurity with the new CMMC certification that our company is now doing. And I'll talk a little bit about that as well if we get a chance. But I wanted to change the conversation. And the beauty is, back in 1998, Dr. Annie Adams of Open University published a paper that I read that I think everybody should read. It's called Users Are Not the Enemy. And it talks about passwords. And it talks about how we came up with, and we all know this, we had this brilliant idea that we were going to require complex passwords changed every 90 days, and then not to write them down. And when I worked for that pharmaceutical company, by FDA compliance requirements, we imposed this. And every 90 days, the same thing happened. I'd have to go around and take off everybody's post-it notes, and then I get 100 requests. I can't remember my password because we think that's the safest thing. And from a technical standpoint, 18 characters, complex, no words is very hard to breach.
Okay, who published that paper? This is not the enemy. I'm going to put that in the chat.
It's Dr. Amy Adams out of Open University in the UK. Yeah, she is absolutely amazing. I've been in touch with her ever since. I'm hoping to get over and meet with her in person one of these days. But because of working with her, I also connected with Julie Hanley, Dr. Hanley of NIST, who is working on human-centered cybersecurity, HCC. And she has been amazing, and we've been talking as well.
Okay, it looks like somebody put a link to it in the chat. That's fantastic. Thank you, Amanda.
Wonderful.
So tell me what you do instead. Like if fear isn't working, like if you're trying to express risk to an executive and you don't want to scare them, what do you do instead?
So I start with the journey and conversation, and this is also important because one of the other things we forget is this is a high burnout industry for the cybersecurity professionals. And so one of the two things, and Dr. Adams talked about this, is how many of us find people are doing workarounds around our cybersecurity? You want to take those workarounds as an indication that there's a problem with your cybersecurity. So I just was writing, I'm part of the National Reserve here in Ohio for the Cyber Reserve. And we were presenting to schools, and IT director was talking about the teachers were going around their cybersecurity to do this or that. And it was very frustrating. And so I was talking with him because one of the things is if people are using workarounds, it means they feel that the cybersecurity interferes with their ability to do their job. And I call it cyber friction. If you put too much cyber friction into a daily operation, people are going to just get off the road.
They're going to go around it. Yep.
Go around it. But our solution is we pound hard and punish them into obedience. And it's there's a Dilbert I love. It says the beatings will continue until morale improves.
Yes.
The problem is when you beat people into submission, all they are is resentful. And I remember I was working with a nonprofit once, and the receptionist for this nonprofit would put WeatherBug. And we all know WeatherBug was a keystroke logger way back, but it also told you the weather. She put it on, I took it off. She put it on. Now, this was back in early 2000 when we let everybody have administrative rights because that was a good idea. But so we ended up punishing her and taking away her administrator rights. But the thing that I realized later that we did not do, because she was talking in idle conversations, she lived out 2 hours east of Cleveland. And if you know anything about Ohio, Northeastern Ohio is a snow city. And she needed to know if the weather was going to be bad because she needed to know she's going to have to go early or she wasn't going to get home. It was the easiest fix in the world by taking 5 minutes to talk to her, but instead we took 2 months of punishing her, and all we ended up doing was putting the local news channel onto a browser tab, and she got the same outcome.
There's a couple of people with raised hands. If you want to put your questions in the chat, that would be great, or in the Q&A, either one. Somebody says, what about that? I thought this was a really interesting question. What about the rare cases where the risks are in fact existential to the company? Like if you're trying to communicate risk, and I think what's really important there. So when I like just off the top of my head, when I think about all those risk assessment meetings I've been in with executives, if you're crying wolf all the time, then when you really do have something that's existential, you're not going to be able to differentiate that from all the other risks that you've been communicating, because it all just sounds like, stuff that's not going to happen to them. Think about the person who doesn't say very much, but when they do, everybody listens. I think that's kind of the approach. Is like if everything else I bring to you sounds very reasonable and measured and not existential, then when I do bring something to you that's existential, then that should kind of stick out. I don't know, Ken, what do you think?
And I use a term that I really like called mission safe. If you're going and talking to a CFO, you want to talk mission safe to them. And I'll give you an example of what that means. So we had a company, it was a manufacturing company, and my engineer for 2 months came back and said, I can't get them to back up their server. I can't get them to back up their server. They need to back up their server. It was only $200 a month, which this was a $42 million company. It wasn't a big bill, but he couldn't get him to back it up. So I decided, I'm like, I'm going to stop in and just talk with him and see what's going on. And so I went in there and I sat down with John. I said, John, okay, my engineer keeps telling me that you don't want to talk about a backup. And he said, well, why would I? I said, okay, I got to ask you a question. How do you get your orders in every day? He said, oh, they come from our ERP system. I said, where's your ERP system? He said, I don't know. I said, how long would your system run if you couldn't get to your ERP system? He said, we might be able to run for 2 or 3 hours. I said, what if I told you that your ERP system is that computer next to Mary's desk? That is your server. He said, what are you talking about? I said, that's where your ERP system sits. Is it worth $200 a month to make sure that that doesn't get wiped out? He signed it the very next day. So when you're talking about existential threats, the problem is you have to align it to their daily operations, their daily life. So if you're talking to financial people, talk financial. If you're talking to operational people, talk operational. Don't talk about servers. We all want to talk about backing up servers and defending virtual environments, and they don't care.
Intangible.
Yes. And I'll take a second here to go into CMMC and a real problem that comes into, because a lot of the attacks that come towards the Department of Defense cause no damage to the company. Their goal is to steal the information and know how things work, not shut it down. So it's a very hard journey to get a company to understand why they're investing when there isn't a mission safe conversation. And you just get those sometimes.
I understand that. People with raised hands, if you want to come off mute,
Yeah, please ask questions. I would
go
love
ahead
to.
and ask the question. No?
Or put it in the chat.
Put in the chat, one or the other. Yeah. Okay, so when you've worked with professionals and different customers and things like that, like what, this kind of like switch that flipped in your head when you realized like, okay, scaring people doesn't work, like we got to put things in their terms. I talk to so many chief security officers and so many security engineers that have a hard time wrapping their head around this approach because they can be a little binary in their thinking like, well, it's the right thing to do and what we're doing is wrong and we just need to do what's right and they just need to do the thing, right? And if I just tell them about the thing, they'll do the thing because this is obvious, like they just need to do it. Like how do you start to file the away at some of the rough edges of that kind of more concrete thinking about this, because I think that sort of mindset makes it really, really hard to relate to your business, for you to be relatable to them and vice versa.
And part of what you want to do, and one of the things I wanted to talk about was that cyber engineer experience in life. And I don't know if all of us have thought about this, but you do not get rewarded for success, but you get heavily punished for failure.
Oh
And
yeah.
this is the nature of this type of environment, which makes it hard. I was presenting for the Air Force 2 years ago, and there was an engineer, one of the world-class engineers, and he was fighting with his boss because he had warned about one of the ransomware attacks that were coming, and his boss had said it's not going to hit us. And the problem is we take it as a personal position that we have to always be right or we are a failure because we get punished for failure so severely. And that's different than a lot of other things. If I win a big sale, I get applauded for winning a big sale. But if I don't get breached this year, they say that's your job. But if I get breached even once, then you failed us. You're the worst engineer we've ever met. And so it is a hard journey. It's psychologically unstable for cybersecurity people. And their reaction seems to be in response to that is if I punish everyone, if I make sure nobody can do anything wrong, then I can't get punished for failing. And that goes back to
Fear.
I have a thing on my wall that says a ship in port is safe, but that's not what a ship is for. And I always say, and a ship in dry dock's even safer, and it's totally useless. But that's what we do as cybersecurity professionals. Our goal is to lock everything down to the point where nothing happens. And therefore, thusly, we are safe because if we make one mistake, we're out of a job, our
Yep.
reputation is gone. But if we have 100,000 saves, it's not like you did a great job, you're the best cybersecurity person I ever met. And that dynamic plays out. And you can see it because your CISOs are terrified of the next breach. But the problem is the company doesn't exist to stop a breach. The company exists to make a product or do a service. And those dynamic situations cause a real disconnect.
It's a really great question in the chat, Ken. In which way would you see humanized security reflected in a cybersecurity strategy? Do you see it as a pillar or more as a baseline? How have you seen organizations successfully humanize their security? So if you can, if this is the approach you want to take, where do you start? Is this foundational to your strategy, or is it an element of the strategy? How do you
So it
approach it?
is it is absolutely foundational.
Mhm.
And the journey starts with the conversation of the person, not the data. When we talk in cybersecurity, we always talk about the data. And one of the things that I use, I'll hold up a dollar bill and I'll hold up a $100 bill and I'll hold up a $10,000 bill from the game of life. And I'll ask people, how much money would you spend to defend each of these? And of course, I get 5 or 10 or $20 for the $100 bill, and I get nothing for the $100,000 bill. And I say, what's the difference between $100,000 and $100? And the difference is we value the $100, we don't value the $100,000. So you need to start with what do people value? And one thing that I learned that companies do that I think is great is have these cybersecurity advisory teams that are not made up of cybersecurity professionals, but start to talk to you about what they think cybersecurity is. And it is a different experience. It can be very unnerving because you feel you have to know it all. But when you start to bring other people into the conversation and say, how would you attack the company? How would you defend the company? All of a sudden, they start to be on your side instead of your enemy.
First step in NIST, right? The identify isn't just for the security or the IT team to do. Identify is for the people in the business. You tell me what you have that is worth something to a bad guy that or that would cause great distress if it went down, went away.
Mhm.
You go out there and identify what you think is valuable, what you depend on in your department, and then we'll have a conversation about those things. I mean, I think even at that very first step of what is it we're trying to protect, what is it that's worth something, and what are the priorities? I think that very first step has to include the business. And so when you see that through their eyes, then is a good way to start the conversation. Um, Somebody asked a question about what you do with that CISO who wants to fire people for clicking on simulated fish, because
Um,
that's happening a lot lately. This example is a termination after 4 or 5 fish test failures. My personal feeling on that is it's training. If you got an answer wrong on your HIPAA training or your some other compliance training that you have to do in your organization, are you going to get fired for that? I mean, the whole point of simulated fishing is to teach you something. You're learning. Um, and so I'm just not a big, I know that you should have escalation plans. I support those. I've managed one before where, you actually go and talk to the person. Gee, what an idea. Like, let's go ask this person, like, why did you click on this? Like, you'll learn a lot just that way. But having people talk to them, you and their boss talk to them together, whatever it is, an escalation plan like that, like I'm a fan of that. I just don't know how I feel about people. I don't think that's great for if you're trying to really work with your business and encourage a culture where the business talks to you and people will report things and they tell you when they think security should be involved in something, and you want that kind of culture where people are seeking out services from the security team and involving you upstream and things. I don't know if terminations for phishing is like gonna do the being an asset to that kind of culture. I don't know, what do you think, Ken?
Well, it'll do one job for sure. It'll cause everyone else to not want to work in your company. And I'll give you another real life example. I was presenting to a bunch of CEOs, and one of the CEOs stood up and said, "We fired our CFO because he passed out $170,000." And I was like, "Okay, sounds great. Let's talk about what happened." And so what happened was they got a false invoice in. He processed a false invoice to the wrong bank account, and they fired him. And I said, "Okay, so this is what I want to know. One, was he a bad CFO? Well, no. Did he have any write-ups? Were there other performance-based issues?" And the answer was no to everything. I said, "Then this is the culture you have now built. If he would not have shared this, he wouldn't be fired. So you have told everyone in your company, never be psychologically safe again, hide any mistakes, and bury everything you can." And that's not a culture that grows a company. So if you fire because you're testing them and they're failing, you need to ask, what is failing in my system, not what is failing in the person. Because if they keep doing it, they either don't value what you've trained them on, they don't understand what you're training them on, or your training is not functional. And that's hard because that extreme ownership conversation, how do I become responsible for my team? And yes, you do have a small percentage of people that just will never get on board, but usually they'll have other disciplinary or performance issues. And this is just one of many, and they need a pep but if they have no other performance issues, if they do good work and everything, and they just keep failing on email, I would look at what you're doing for your training.
Chris was asking in this question if there's data available. I think I would look at data around culture and having a punitive culture. There's not I don't think, I haven't seen any data that says that this is a bad approach to take with simulated phishing, but there's plenty of content out there from academics and about having a punitive culture in your organization, and people more likely or less likely to report things in general. So I think maybe looking for something that is outside of the world of security that just talks more about corporate culture, that you might find more to support if you're looking for things to support your argument, if you're looking for data, that might be helpful.
And if you're looking, a great book to look at is The Fearless Organization and Psychological Safety. And one of the examples that was in that book was they took two nursing groups. Now, this isn't cybersecurity, this is nursing errors. And when they implemented psychological safety in the one group and versus the other, the number of incidents increased. But what you ended up finding out was the nursing group that didn't have psychological safety was hiding mistakes, and they weren't able to correct the small errors, leading to larger and larger errors when they finally did come out.
Be a great study to show your CISO if you're to change that. Where is that from?
It's called The Fearless Organization by
Fearless
Dr.
Organization.
Edmondson.
I have to find more time to read this year, Ken. That should be one of my New Year's resolutions.
And that's one of the things that I made myself walk to be healthier, and I listen to books when I do it. And so been listening to lots of books on emotional intelligence and psychological safety, and outside of what would normally be just the cybersecurity suite.
Boy, a lot of good stuff in the comments. Let me see.
Let's see what else we got.
Somebody asked about, have you ever had to work with, since you were a coder, have you had to work with software engineers, and how do you convince them that they need to be interested in things like no longer coding, cross-site scripting? Like, how do you get, I have experience trying to get, I ran, while you think about this, how you approach engineers, software engineers about security. We decided, our executive leadership at a company I work for decided that there would be, that everybody's going to go through OWASP Top 10 training on the engineering team. Well, we're a tech company. We got a lot of engineers. And of course, there were some eye rolls as soon as the head of engineering came to me and said, "Lisa, I want you to make them want it." And so I had to do a lot of work on the culture and getting them interested and like piquing their interest. And I have a presentation that I still use actually to this day. I've given it a few different companies called They're Just Like Us. And it talked about like, here's these great software engineers and, like look at their skill set. Here's their LinkedIn profiles. This guy's done implementations all over the globe. And then like, guess what? That was malware. It kind of peel back the persona of these people and talk about like how good their skills are and but they're doing it for malicious purposes, but that's who you're up against, because I don't think they understand the skill level, just how, I mean, there's a lot of dumb criminals, but the smart criminals are the really bad ones, and some of them are just very, very, very technically adept. And so as soon as, because I know I spent enough time with developers to know that they kind of like to one up each other with their coding skills, right? They like to be the one who can solve a problem quicker than anybody else on the team. Um, and so I knew if I appealed to that sense of like developer pride and ego, that maybe that would pique their interest and they would understand a little more about like the persona of the adversary. Like it's somebody who's just like you, but they're trying to do harm. And so that's why you got to bring your A game. And here's what a vulnerability is, and here's what's a bad thing. And if we stop coding these, then it was the first rule of holes. It was stop digging. Like if we can stop making the hole deeper, then maybe we can actually get around to fixing some criticals and highs too. Um, anyway, that was culturally, that was how I did. And then we had some fun with how we actually implemented the training and some pizza parties and things like that. But what's your experience there, Ken? How do you get developers interested in learning about secure coding?
There, you have a ton of what you said right there is exactly right. It's a culture conversation. And I always remember now coming from my MBAs in operations, my undergraduates in operations, Toyota versus Ford. And I always love the example. Ford's quality was a hammer at the end of the process. And this is not a joke. They would literally go over and they would hammer out all the imperfections
It's
after
Fleming.
the
I
car
can't test quality into your product.
versus Toyota, which put quality into the product. This is the same conversation, same journey. You want to create a positive culture. You want good code to be the desirable outcome, but you have to define that. And you can't say, just be safe. You need to make sure they understand what safe is and how they can be better at it. And you should award safe programming. You should make it so that when they start programming and they finish programming, they are recognized. Because I know I wanted to be recognized. I know when I wrote code, I wanted people to say, wow, that was good code. You were very efficient. When I was doing it back in the 90s, that was when they used to pay for the kill line of code, which was the dumbest way to write code. Because let me tell you, if you pay me for every 1,000 lines of code, guess how many 1,000 lines of code you're going to have in your document at the end? And so I was coming in when that industry was dying out. And so I remember my first programming job, the first program I looked at was 1.76 million lines of code. And I wrote it and rewrote it down to 1,200. So you want to reward what you want them to do. Like you said, make it a challenge, make it a competition, make sure they understand what it is they're facing, why we need to do it. Make sure they understand what the user at the end is going to experience, because they don't want to have their stuff breached, but they're also going to be efficient. And a lot of times we disconnect efficiency from security, and that can cause a real problem. And again, mission safe has to be part of the conversation. I'm doing a lot with a lot of different UI people, and UI can be one of the least safe environments when they build it, because they're trying to build it to be quick for the user. And you do have to do that. You don't want it to be too onerous, but there has to be a little bit of friction to create the safety they need.
A lot of people in the Q&A talking about what they do for repeat offenders, as we call them, people who are clicking on fish too much, and that whole culture of reporting. That's really, really important.
Yeah.
What have we not gotten to yet, Ken, that you want to talk about?
Well, one thing for everyone here that can also be helpful is reward people who identify phishing. Have a contest. If you identify a phishing attack, even if they identify wrong, it's more about the cultural habit of looking for a phishing to win something instead of punishing them. Because I'm going to tell you something, we don't think about this. but a simulated phishing is a punishment. Almost every time you click on it, you go do a video training or you have to do a video training. And let me ask you this. Imagine your day and I come in randomly in the middle of it and I say, okay, now you have to stop working and go take a 10-minute video. That's a punishment because that means I can't get my job done. What if instead you have the remediatory stuff, but if you identify it, you get a chance to win $10 or you get a chance to be awarded in front of the company or something that says doing the right behavior is a reward instead of the wrong behavior is a punishment. And see if that can change. And then the people who continue to repeat, do sit them down, talk to them. It's very rare. I've never met anyone, like I said, that does that one thing over and over and hasn't other problems if they need to be fired. So,
That's probably true.
that's a big one. And in this journey, and I know all of us are starting to talk about, and I'm actually going to Dayton tomorrow to present on AI, but this is going to be a major issue in what we do coming up next. You talk about that coding. Well, now I can get literally somebody with no coding skills to be able to have a decent hacking program by a couple of questions into AI. And I was just reading about Miramar, the country which is now the #1 cyber criminal country in the world. And
Yep.
basically all they're doing is they're grabbing anyone off the street, putting in front of ChatGPT.
Human trafficking people into those centers in Myanmar. Yeah.
And then all they do is just type in, the person said this, how do I make them feel happy? And it gives a response and they then post it back. And I want to take a moment here. I did a post on LinkedIn because I got this text that said, I hope you're having a wonderful, joyous day. And that's all the text said. And I sat there because of course we have this, how can people be so stupid? And that's another big thing I work on is this victim shaming approach to cybersecurity. And I sat there and I was looking at it and I was thinking to myself, it felt nice. It felt good to get a positive affirmation. I know it was a cyber attack, but what happens if you just lost a loved one? What happens if you got fired? If something negative enough that you need that positive reinforcement happens, you're going to act on that. And if we call you stupid for doing it, you're going to bury that deep down and keep going after the person that make you feel good. Nobody I've ever met felt like, oh, thank you for calling me stupid. That made my day. But I promise you, the people I say, you've been wonderful. I really appreciate what you're doing today, want to have more of that. And so when we attack people that are attacked, we encourage them to be attacked. We encourage them to hide what happened, making more people vulnerable to attack. And we have to get around. And that is actually what you're doing with that punishing them, firing them if they fail 6 times. You're punishing the victim. What is it about what they're seeing is causing them to think they need to click? That takes effort. Firing them is easy. It's, oh, 6 failures, you're out the door, we're done talking. But then the next person you bring in could become the same thing. And the next person could become the same thing. You never address the underlying risk, which is, why do human beings need to respond to that? And we all talk about, the important urgent conversation, email, text, those are urgent without usually being important. And how do we help people understand that matrix? Because I know my phone here, it's like, oh, what's happening? Oh, it's LinkedIn text. And we have a lot of that going on in our lives. And anything that makes us feel good is more likely to get responded to.
Yep. I'm going to ask you one last question here. Somebody asked a question that kind of it stands out compared to the other ones. And it's something that we're working on right now. We're working on a campaign for the aging population, and we've been doing a listening tour, talking to a lot of aging folks, asking them what they struggle with and everything. I know that I have my own struggles with my mom and my aunt and trying to help people in my family. We have a ton of resources on StaySafeOnline.org for helping your aging relatives. And even if it's your mom, your aunt, whoever in your family, how do you approach this conversation with them? I mean, I'm just constantly saying, Mom, don't click on those things.
And I am actually doing for our community college a senior conversation. And there's what?
It's cool. We should talk about that. I'd like to see what you're doing.
I would love to talk about that. So I have what I call relax, evaluate, act. And it is 3 steps. Every one of our parents probably said the count to 10 before you, when you're angry, count to 10 before you say anything. This is how our human mind works. Emotions are the lowest level, fastest response in our body. So an emotional effect will get a response before our rational mind is able to catch up to it. And I'm actually working on a startup called Clear Intent AI, which is designed to put a 4 or 5 second pause into a conversation. Because, and you'll see this repeatedly. I've seen this in the conversations I've had with elderly that have been attacked. There is this constant barrage when they have you on the phone. There is if you talk to anyone, we can't help you anymore. So it is a panic situation. It's a constant barrage and it's an overwhelm. They'll call at 2 in the morning when your brain is not able to file up. And so the intent of Clear Intent AI is to listen to the phone call, look for these habits that say things like, you can't talk to anyone. This is the FBI. This is the CIA. Anything that would cause that authority response, because human beings were designed for authority response, without giving the time for rational reevaluation. So one of the things I tell people is obviously you shouldn't answer the phone if you don't know the phone number. Use your voicemail. If there's somebody real, they'll leave their voicemail. But we all know phone is that urgent, not important situation. Especially elderly will answer their phones and want to talk. We need to remember to also give them grace. We need to be, and this is where that victim shaming can be very devastating. If you've been talking, and I did this, I talked with a person that connected with me on LinkedIn for 4 months. I knew it was a scam. It was a beautiful Russian woman who had to talk to me, had to, because I'm that handsome. I just attract Russian women. But I talked with her, and for 4 months, all she did was build me up. She told me how exciting it was. And then she started talking about her family, how she was estranged from her daughter because the father had taken her to Atlanta. She needed an operation. She didn't have money for it.
And she needed money.
And she needed money. But 4 months later, it becomes very hard to untangle my desire for that to be real from what's really happening. And if you were my wife or something and you came to me and you said, Ken, that's wrong, my first reaction is, no, you're wrong, I'm right, I want to protect this person. And so we have to have that. And one of the things Clear Intent AI does is it will allow a way for a text or a phone call to go to a loved one so that they can call you at that first call before they become emotionally engaged. And that's the type of stuff you want to do, because we can't. People are social engineered people. We need it to live. You stop at
Can't make ourselves not human.
What?
Yeah. We can't make ourselves not human. Yeah. Okay, we are over time.
Of course.
So
Sorry.
I'm gonna wrap us up today. I know there's a lot of questions we didn't get to. People asking questions about simulated phishing programs, details about those. I can tell you that the SANS community has a ton of practitioners on it who have a lot of advice, and there'll be a lot of people there to help you if you wanted to join that community and ask that question. A lot of great questions and a lot of great stuff going on in the chat. If you enjoyed this and you like this conversation, it's speakers like Ken and topics like this that we talk about at Convene. So I would encourage you to look at joining us in Florida in March, or the next one will be, not sure yet, Midwest, New England, somewhere, maybe early September, late August timeframe. But the next one coming up is going to be in Florida. And who doesn't want to go to Florida? Yeah. Anyway, thanks, Ken. Congratulations to the winner, and I hope to see you there. Thanks a lot, Ken. This was really good, super fun.
Absolutely wonderful. And anyone that wants to join me on LinkedIn, I'd love to have you follow me. Ask your questions there. I try every day to respond to anything people ask.
Thank you very much.